Have you ever wondered how to bring that retro 80s R&B vibe back into your tracks? Well, today I'm going to be doing a deep dive into how to replicate that sound to help to define an era. Think along the lines of producers like Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, Teddy Riley, and R&B groups like New Edition. I'm going to show you step by step how I recreated that classic R&B sound with lush chords, those unmistakable R&B keys, and soulful melodies. Let's get into it. So first up, let's start with those keys. So like I said in the intro, when you think about a lot of R&B records from the 1980s and even the early 90s, these keys are really unmistakable. And for this track, I went with the JD850 Contact Library, which is an emulation of the Roland JD800. But if you want to do something like this and you don't have this Contact Library, it's perfectly fine. These keys are basically just an FM synthesis E-piano. So if you have the DX7 from Arturia, or if you have Analog Lab from Arturia, then look for the DX7 presets, because the DX7 was actually one of the most popular keyboards that R&B artists from the 1980s used to use to get this sound. Also, if you have the Lounge Lizard EP4 or FM8 from Native Instruments, you'll also be able to find keys like this as well. Next up, I decided to add some bass. And for that bass, I decided to go with Diva, and then I ran it through some EQ so that I could cut out a bunch of frequencies that I didn't need. And we're actually not quite done with the bass yet, because the next thing that I did was I layered that with another bass guitar. Now that is really subtle, but it does give the synth bass a lot more bottom. And also layering a bunch of different sounds together is a technique that a lot of producers back in the 1980s were using in order to make their sounds a little bit more unique. Next up, I added one of my favorite sounds that they used to add to some songs in the 1980s, which is the marimba. Like I said, that's one of my personal favorite sounds that producers used to put on records back in the day. As a matter of fact, if you listen to Sky's the Limit from the Notorious B.I.G., which is one of my favorite records from him, that sound that they chopped up at the beginning of that record in order to start it off, that's a marimba. And then I also used another JD850 marimba, just a different preset this time, and I used that to layer the first one. And then R&B producers in the 80s were really big on adding ear candy to their records. So the first sound that I went with was this vocal guitar. Beautiful. And for that, I used another instance of the JD850. The next sound that I added for some ear candy was this piano stab, which is another JD850 preset. And then last, I decided to sprinkle in some keys like this, which is yet another JD850 sound. CL Projects might owe me some libraries. Now, if I was sending this off as a sample, other than some light percussion, I probably would just leave this exactly as is. But since this is a tutorial, I decided to have a little bit more fun and add some drums to it. Now, all of these drum sounds are coming from Addictive Drums too, but I'll break down which individual drum machines I used. So for the kick, I went with the Linn drum sound. For the first snare, I went with the Simmons SDS. For the second snare, I also went with the Simmons SDS. I just used a different sound. For the first set of hi-hats, I actually went with the Simmons SDS. For the 808 percussion, believe it or not, I went with the 808. Same thing for the 808 shaker. And then for the last hi-hat, I went with the Linn drum. And then here's what the drums sound like. So it's not quite New Jack swing, it's more so like Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis drums. But in order to get the drums to swing like this, the two main things that I focused on was I shifted over some of the MIDI kicks, because if I didn't, they would sound more like this. And then for the hi-hats, I basically did the same thing in regards to making sure that they have a swing. So all the hi-hats on the 1s and the 3s are basically on the grid, and then the 2s and the 4s are shifted over. And I did add some toms as a drum fill, but you'll hear what those sounds like once I play everything together. So that was my deep dive into how you could recreate that classic 80s R&B sound. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you like that sample and you want to use it, it's actually a part of my new sample pack Genesis, which is out now. Just hit the link in the description. And if you really love that 80s sound and you want to learn how to make something that sounds a little bit closer to Bruno Mars or even Prince, check out this video right here.